Northeastern Utah experienced a dry summer in 1951, yet no one seemed concerned about the weather. They were observing the aircraft. A single-engine Cessna banked low over a granite basin at 11,000 feet, its wings tilting against a cloudless sky. Below it, a lake sat like a piece of dropped mirror, cold, still, and utterly alone. No road reached it. No trail connected it to the valley below. The nearest town was 40 miles away. The nearest human being was probably the pilot. Then the plane passed overhead, and the water erupted. Thousands of small silver shapes broke the surface and vanished. Within seconds, the lake was calm again. The ripples spread outward and dissolved. The Cessna climbed back toward the ridge and banked northeast, already tracking toward the next basin on its route. What entered those waters that morning had never existed there before, not in 10,000 years, not since the ice retreated and left behind these lakes, not once. The predator had arrived. The Uinta Mountains occupy a particular place in the American imagination, or they would, if more Americans knew they existed. Tucked into the northeastern corner of Utah, they run east to west, a geological anomaly in a continent where every other major range runs north to south. The result is unmistakable: a vast elevated plateau of exposed granite and ancient rock, carved by glaciers into one of the most complex lake systems in the western United States. During the last ice age, glaciers advanced and retreated across these peaks over tens of thousands of years, grinding the bedrock into deep basins. When the ice finally withdrew around 10 to 12,000 years ago, snowmelt filled those basins until they became lakes, hundreds of them, scattered across remote wilderness terrain at elevations between 9 and 12,000 feet, some barely larger than a country road, others covering several acres of cold, clear, extraordinarily deep water. The Uintas sit at the heart of a broader western landscape that includes ranges across California, Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, together containing thousands of alpine lakes. What defines them ecologically is isolation. Waterfalls, steep gradients, and sheer elevation prevented fish from naturally colonizing most of these waters. The barriers were absolute. Over thousands of years, fish simply never made it in. For the ecosystems that evolved inside those basins, the absence of fish was not a disadvantage. It was the fundamental condition of existence. Frogs bred in the open shallows without fear, depositing egg masses in the shallowest margins, exactly where a visual predator would hunt, because nothing was hunting them. Salamanders moved freely through shoreline habitats. Zooplankton drifted in densities impossible where fish were present. Aquatic insects completed their life cycles without a vertebrate predator waiting beneath the surface. Every organism had evolved inside a world where nothing hunted from below the waterline. The result was something ecologically rare and almost incomprehensibly fragile: a complete ecosystem built entirely around the absence of fish. In the early 20th century, nobody understood this. What people saw when they looked at these lakes was a different thing entirely. They saw emptiness. The idea of stocking high-elevation lakes with trout did not begin in Utah. It began in California in the late 1800s, when state fish commissioners began packing fingerlings on horseback into the Sierra Nevada and releasing them wherever water existed. The logic was simple and entirely consistent with the wildlife management philosophy of the era. A fishless lake was a wasted lake. Nature had made an error. Human intervention would correct it. By the 1920s and 1930s, stocking programs had expanded dramatically across the West. State agencies raised trout in hatcheries and transported them by any available means into alpine waters that had never contained fish. The effort was enormous and genuinely popular. Anglers traveled hundreds of miles for the opportunity to cast a line in a remote mountain lake. The fishing was extraordinary precisely because the fish had never learned to be cautious. The real transformation came in the late 1940s, when someone recognized that the bottleneck in the entire operation was transportation. Reaching remote lakes on foot or horseback was slow and limited in scale, but an airplane could cover dozens of lakes in a single morning. The question was whether fish could survive being dropped from altitude into open water. The answer was almost certainly yes, provided the fish were small enough and the drop altitude was controlled. Fingerlings, typically 3 to 4 inches long, had a surface area to mass ratio that allowed them to decelerate rapidly through the air. At low drop altitudes, often less than 150 feet above the water, survival rates reached 95% or higher. The physics were almost accidentally perfect. California piloted the technique first. Utah followed within years. By the mid-1950s, Utah's Division of Wildlife Resources had developed a systematic aerial stalking program that would ultimately reach hundreds of lakes across the Uinta Mountains. A specially modified Cessna carried up to 7 chambers beneath its fuselage, each loaded with fingerlings in oxygenated water. A single flight could service 40 to 60 lakes in a day, covering terrain that would take a backpacker several weeks to traverse on foot. The program was, by every measure the agencies were using, an extraordinary success. Rainbow trout, brook trout, cutthroat, and Arctic grayling thrived in the cold, clear alpine lakes. Recreational fishing became a significant economic engine for northeastern Utah, generating millions of dollars annually. The fishing culture of the Uintas became inseparable from the identity of the region, a tradition passed between generations, a source of genuine pride. For nearly 50 years, the program ran without serious ecological scrutiny. The fish thrived, the anglers came, the agencies expanded the stocking lists, the lakes looked beautiful, everything appeared normal. That was precisely the problem. Logan Hayes had been hiking into the Uintas for 11 summers by the time he noticed something wrong. He was a wilderness fisheries technician for the state, part of a small crew conducting periodic surveys of alpine lakes, measuring dissolved oxygen, recording fish populations, filling out forms that accumulated in agency filing cabinets in Vernal. He was good at his job. He loved the mountains. He did not consider himself a scientist, but he had the quality that matters most in fieldwork. He paid attention. In the summer of 2009, Hayes was surveying a cluster of lakes in a remote drainage he had visited twice before. The fishing was excellent. He had no reason to expect anything unusual. But at the third lake that week, something stopped him at the water's edge. It was the silence. He had grown accustomed to the ambient soundtrack of mountain wetlands, the calls of chorus frogs, the splash of a leopard frog entering the water, the chirring of insects in the shoreline vegetation. In late July, alpine lake margins were supposed to be noisy with biological activity. He stood at the edge and heard nothing. He searched the shallows for egg masses. Nothing. He walked the entire perimeter looking for tadpoles, for juvenile amphibians, for any sign of breeding activity. Nothing. A survey from the early 1990s had recorded boreal chorus frogs and Columbia spotted frogs breeding in these same margins. Those populations had apparently been present for as long as anyone had been documenting the lake. Hayes filed his observations and moved on. But over the following 3 summers, he began paying deliberate attention to amphibians at every lake he visited, keeping unofficial notes alongside his formal data. What emerged was deeply unsettling. At lake after lake containing thriving trout populations, amphibian presence was minimal or entirely absent. At naturally fishless lakes, too shallow, too isolated, or too high to have been effectively stocked, he consistently found frogs, salamanders, and egg masses in exactly the densities the old records described. The correlation was imperfect, but unmistakable. He brought his notes to the agency. The response was polite skepticism. Amphibian populations fluctuated naturally. Disease was a possibility. There was no smoking gun. But Hayes had spent 11 summers in those mountains. He trusted what he had seen. He started making calls. The researchers who eventually took up the question brought crucial context. Scientists from UC Davis and collaborating ecologists across the West had spent more than a decade documenting the collapse of the mountain yellow-legged frog, once one of the most abundant amphibians in the Sierra Nevada, found in nearly every alpine lake at mid to high elevations. By the early 2000s, the species had vanished from over 90% of its historical range, becoming one of the most rapidly declining vertebrates in North America. The pattern from Sierra Nevada research was straightforward and devastating. Lake by lake, the presence of introduced trout correlated almost perfectly with the absence of mountain yellow-legged frogs. Lakes never stocked retained frog populations. Lakes that had been stocked had lost them. The mechanism was not mysterious. Trout are efficient visual predators that target moving objects in the water column. Tadpoles, which spend months feeding near the surface before metamorphosing, are essentially living bait. A frog species that had evolved for 10,000 years without a vertebrate predator had no instinctive response to one. The tadpoles simply didn't flee. When Sierra Nevada researchers compared notes with ecologists in Utah, Wyoming, and Idaho, the same pattern appeared across thousands of miles of mountain wilderness. The aerial stalking programs of the mid-20th century had transformed alpine lake ecosystems on a continental scale. The change was not visible from the surface. The water was still clear, the trout looked healthy, but beneath it, ecosystems that had functioned a particular way for 10,000 years were operating under entirely different biological rules. The zooplankton record was particularly striking. In naturally fishless alpine lakes, large-bodied zooplankton dominate the water column, grazing on algae and transferring energy upward through the food web. In lakes with trout, these organisms are essentially eliminated. Trout can see and target them efficiently. What replaces them are smaller, faster reproducing species that fall below the visual threshold of trout predation. Invisible to the casual observer, the shift represents a fundamental restructuring of how energy moves through the system. Aquatic insect communities told a similar story. Dragonfly larvae, apex invertebrate predators in fishless lakes, declined sharply where trout were present. Mayfly communities shifted towards species that could complete their life cycles more quickly, or find refuge where trout hunting was less efficient. The whole invisible architecture of the ecosystem reorganized itself around the new predator. By 2015, the evidence was no longer circumstantial. Researchers had accumulated data from hundreds of paired lakes across multiple states. The aerial stalking programs had not improved empty lakes. They had transformed complete ecosystems into something fundamentally different. The question that followed was harder to answer. Could they be restored? In 2002, researchers in the Sierra Nevada conducted what seemed like a risky experiment. They arranged for the mechanical removal of trout from 12 lakes that had once supported mountain yellow-legged frog populations. Using gill nets and electroshocking equipment, crews spent multiple seasons systematically eliminating trout from these waters. It was expensive, and there was no guarantee of what would happen afterward. What happened was not gradual. It was almost shocking in its speed. Within 2 to 3 years of trout removal, mountain yellow-legged frogs began recolonizing the restored lakes, not from reintroduction, but on their own, crossing overland at night from remnant populations in nearby fishless waters. Within 5 to 8 years, breeding populations had re-established themselves in lakes where the species had been absent for decades. The ecosystem, it turned out, had not forgotten what it was. Given the opportunity, it moved back toward its original configuration with remarkable fidelity. The Columbia spotted frogs of the Uinta Mountains told a similar story, where managers began selectively removing trout from isolated basins in the early 2010s. Amphibian activity returned within a few field seasons. Zooplankton communities shifted back toward large-bodied species. Aquatic insect diversity increased. The shoreline margins became noisy again in July. The recovery was not free. Trout removal from a single alpine lake could cost between $20,000 and $80,000 depending on size, depth, and accessibility. A comprehensive restoration program across hundreds of lakes would require tens of millions of dollars and decades of sustained effort. Western states were grappling with how to balance those costs against a recreational fishery economy worth hundreds of millions annually, an industry built directly on top of the stocking programs. The math of restoration raised uncomfortable questions that nobody had a clean answer to. But the frogs kept coming back. There is a moment in the history of any ecological crisis when the story stops being about the immediate threat and becomes about something larger. The Trout story reached that moment quietly, in the accumulation of field data from dozens of researchers working across the American West over more than 2 decades. What they had uncovered was not simply a problem with a specific wildlife management technique. They had uncovered the cost of a foundational assumption, one that had guided decisions across North American conservation for more than a century. The assumption was this: a landscape without a particular species was a landscape waiting to be improved. Nature made errors. Management corrected them. The measure of a good alpine lake was the quality of fishing it could provide. That assumption was not malicious. In many ways, it was born of genuine affection for wild places, a desire to share them, to make them productive, to connect people to landscapes that would otherwise remain inaccessible. The anglers who traveled 12 miles into the Uintas for a day of fishing in the shadow of 13,000-foot peaks were not destroying something. They were seeking something real and meaningful in a world that offered fewer and fewer wild places to find it. The tragedy was not that anyone had done something wrong. The tragedy was that the ecosystem had been transformed before anyone understood what it was. For the frogs, the tragedy was existential. For the zooplankton, invisible. For the aquatic insects, incremental. But for the broader understanding of what alpine lakes actually are, the stocking programs had conducted an inadvertent continent-scale experiment in ecosystem transformation, one whose full consequences are still being measured. The Uinta Mountains today contain a mosaic of managed outcomes. Some lakes are still actively stocked. Others have been removed from stocking lists and are recovering. A handful of high-priority lakes have had trout actively removed and are now protected as fishless refugia. Every summer, the Cessna still flies its routes over the backcountry, and every summer, field technicians hike into remote basins carrying nets and oxygen meters, looking for patterns in the data that will tell them what is happening beneath the surface. The frogs are still returning, wherever they are given the space to do so. Something continues in these mountains that is older than the fishing program, older than the state of Utah, older than the written history of the American West. Every July, in a handful of cold granite basins where the trout have been removed and the ecosystem has been allowed to reassemble itself, a mountain frog climbs into shallow water and deposits an egg mass in the sunlight. It does not know what has changed or what has been returned to it. It is simply doing what its lineage has done in these mountains for 10,000 years. The question of what these lakes should be, what they are for, who they belong to, which version of them contains the most value, is a question that science can inform but cannot answer alone. It is a question about what humans owe to ecosystems they have altered, and whether a landscape's worth can be measured only by what it provides to the people who visit it. For thousands of years, nothing hunted these lakes. Then one summer, predators started falling from the sky, and the silence that followed took decades to notice, and more decades to understand. The lakes are not empty. They never were.